The Arctic Ocean is heating up at a much faster pace than the rest of the Earth. Temperatures over parts of the Arctic will increase as much as 54 degrees Fahrenheit this month.
Our house is on fire. Our house is falling apart.
We are right now about 11 years away from that climate breakdown will become irreversible.
This is you. You've probably been hearing a lot about climate change and how you should reduce your carbon footprint.
This story of going green, even though we see it everywhere, has some serious shortcomings. It says that if I become a smarter shopper and tell all my friends to do the same, I've done my part. And if I don't buy all this green stuff, then it's my fault the planet's being destroyed. Wait a minute, my fault? I didn't choose to put toxic products on the shelves or allow slave labor in factories around the world. I didn't choose to fill stores with electronics that can't be repaired and have to be thrown away. I didn't choose a world in which some people can afford to live green, leaving the rest of us to be irresponsible planet wreckers.
How many listicles have you read proposing the 10 best ways to live a greener life? Do you feel obligated to recycle, carpool or bike to work, use energy-efficient light bulbs, or buy local produce? These are all good things, and the world is certainly no worse off for individuals trying to be more eco-friendly. The only problem is, the push for individuals to, quote, make the ethical choice and greenify their own lives is a massive scam. Sure, we should all try to be more conscious with our consumption, but by taking on the mantle of climate warrior ourselves, we've been swindled into letting the real culprits off the hook.
We've been victims of a campaign of systematic misdirection.
In the 1920s, business leaders were faced with a dilemma. Overproduction of goods had exceeded demand. Production between 1860 and 1920 had increased by 12 to 14 times, while the population only increased by a factor of 3. There were several ways of solving the problem. One was to reduce working hours and raise wages so that production and consumption reached an equilibrium. This would have led to more leisure time for workers and a higher standard of living. The problem with this solution is that it could have entailed a slight decrease in profits. Corporations are mandated by law to maximize profits on behalf of their shareholders, regardless of social or environmental costs. According to business leaders, there was another problem. John Egerton, president of the National Association of Manufacturers, warned that a shorter work week would undermine the work ethic and potentially foment radicalism. If people had time to stop and think, they might also take the time to rethink their position in life. The emphasis should be put on work, Egerton stated. More work and better work, instead of upon leisure. It seems a harmless enough statement, but what businessmen were advocating was revolutionary. Production would no longer be about satisfying human needs. It would be an end in and of itself. Rather than a democracy of ideas or a democracy of mass participation, the United States would become a democracy of material goods. The citizen would be replaced by the consumer.
In the 1920s, light bulbs lasted 2,500 hours. Today, they last only 1,000 hours. What happened? The first nylon stockings on the market were made to last. What happened then?
They time those things. They time them, so when you finally paid for them, they're used up.
The answer is a hidden mechanism at the heart of the consumer society.
Planned obsolescence. The desire on the part of a consumer to own something a little newer, a little sooner than is necessary.
In this classic British film from 1951, an enterprising young chemist invents a thread which repels dirt and does not wear out. He believes that great progress has been made. But not everyone is happy with his discovery, and soon he finds himself on the run, not only from the factory owners, but also from the workers, all fearing for their jobs. 1940, the chemical giant DuPont announced the arrival of a revolutionary synthetic fiber, nylon. Girls queued around the block to buy the new long-lasting stockings. The DuPont chemists had every reason to be proud of their achievement, as even men touted the strength of nylon stockings. A stocking that lasted was celebrated as great progress, but the joy was short-lived. DuPont gave new instructions.
Come out with something that was more fragile and would run so that the stockings wouldn't last as long.
Stockings soon started to run again. The same chemists who'd applied their skills to make durable nylons went with the spirit of the times and made them more fragile. The everlasting thread disappeared from the factory floor, just like in the cinema.
We need control of this discovery. Complete control. If you want twice the amount in that contract, we will pay it.
$250,000.
To suppress it. Yes.
In the late 1950s, ordinary consumers began to ask questions about planned obsolescence and the tricks of manufacturers. The Consumers Union of America tested a wide range of products, focusing on lifespans and durability. They published the results in their magazine, which had growing circulation and influence. They also began lobbying for official consumer laws. 20 years later, consumers would win an important first victory over planned obsolescence when the first warranty laws came into force.
Jeremy, how'd the boys look when they left?
Popular culture, too, started echoing the frustration of ordinary citizens with planned obsolescence.
It was very payment on the receipt.
It even made an appearance in Arthur Miller's classic play, Death of a Salesman.
Once in my life, I'd like to own something outright before it's broken. I'm always in a race with the junkyard. Just finished paying for the car, and it's on its last legs. The refrigerator consumes belts like a crazy maniac. They time those things. They time them, so when you finally paid for them, they're used up.
The Waste Makers, published in 1960, was the first academic analysis of planned obsolescence. The author, Vance Packard, had shot to fame with a book about the powers of advertising. His new work became a bestseller.
Good evening, Mrs. Packard.
In a rare television appearance, he discussed the future of a society based on consumerism and waste.
I have a feeling that we're in for some grim days ahead. I think the over-commercialization of American life is starting to change our American character in some ways that disturb me. I think we're becoming more self-indulgent as a people. And I think to some extent we're being encouraged to be more self-indulgent.
Well, that's kind of a grim prophecy.
Well, I wish I could be more cheerful.
Consumerism was now deep inside our heads, exploiting our deepest feelings, our emotions, and even our identities. We were all being trained to desire.
Well, let's talk waste.
Consider the soda bottle. In 1947, 100% of soda was sold in refillable bottles. But in the 1950s, a few soda makers realized that it was cheaper to make soda at one centralized factory and ship it around the country by putting it in bottles that could just be thrown away. When disposable bottles were introduced, people didn't know what to do with them. There were few public garbage bins, and people would throw them on the ground if they weren't at home. A major littering problem had arrived. Manufacturers didn't want to take the blame for this problem. So in 1953, a group of businesses, including Philip Morris, PepsiCo, and Coca-Cola, created the nonprofit Keep America Beautiful. Their goal was to teach us that picking up trash was our personal responsibility, not theirs. By 1969, only 67% of soda was sold in refillable bottles. 1/3 of all bottles were designed to be thrown away. Soon landfills began taking up more and more space. By the 1980s, cities and municipalities began introducing recycling to divert materials from the waste stream. In many ways, recycling is a success. Recycling programs prevented 85.1 million tons of materials from being thrown away in 2010. But has it stopped us from filling up landfills? No, it's just slowed the process down. By 1998, 0.5% of soda was sold in refillable bottles. Even when we have good intentions, a recycled material may not be the best one. For example, plastic bottles made from PET are frequently melted down to create synthetic fibers. But PET wasn't designed to be recycled. Many experts warn that as the fibers age, they release toxins.
It's not bad shoppers here who are the source of the problem. It's bad policies and bad business practices here. And that's why the solutions we really need are not for sale at the supermarket.
It's about the idea that the elites trying to implant in your brain the idea that the way you deal with your waste at home is actually the central question for humanity in the 21st century, not only for your life, but for the planet Earth and even more. So you are responsible for separating the waste you produced. You terrible consumer, you're to blame for the whole misery. And of course it encourages a lot of very negative things. Talk about the bin police here in Britain. We've got all that. We've got lockable bins, we've got the bin police, we've got video cameras who's gonna watch exactly where you're gonna throw your green bottle in what kind of bin. So it encourages a very negative neighborhood atmosphere, spying out your neighbors. Distrust is part of that whole program. And of course, maybe most importantly, it absolutely refocuses your general outlook in life and the question you should ask. Instead of asking questions, how can we get on in society? How can we get more? How can we increase our living standards? How can we develop society as a whole? You're asked to separate your waste, to wash out your yogurt cup, and make sure your next door neighbor knows exactly how to deal with all these important problems.
In 2005, per capita municipal waste production, basically everything that's put out at the curb, in the United States was about 1,660 pounds. Let's say you're a die-hard simple living activist, and you reduce this number to 0. You recycle everything. You bring cloth bags shopping. You fix your toaster. Your toes poke out of your old tennis shoes. You're not done yet though. Since municipal waste includes not just residential waste, but also waste from government offices and businesses, you march down to those offices, waste reduction pamphlets in hand, and convince them to cut down on their waste enough to eliminate your share of it. Well, I've got some bad news. The municipal waste accounts for only 3% of total waste production in the United States. Or let's talk water. We so often hear that the world is running out of water. People are dying from lack of water. Rivers are dewatered from lack of water. And while this is true, we're told that because of this, we must take shorter showers. But see the disconnect? Because I take showers, I'm responsible for drawing down aquifers? Well, no. More than 90% of the water used by humans is used by agriculture and industry. The remaining 10% is split between municipalities and actual living, breathing individual humans. Collectively, municipal golf courses use as much water as municipal human beings. People, both human people and fish people, aren't dying because the world is running out of water. They're dying because the water is being stolen.
Today's economy is still scandalously inefficient in its use of energy, water and raw materials. Yet the technologies we need already exist, and with massive new investment they will become both more efficient and cheaper. And that's where we come to the role of government.
There are roughly 22.5 million washing machines in the UK, between them performing about 6 billion washes every year. Now, an inefficient washing machine uses around 100 litres per wash. An efficient one, around 45 litres. So simply moving over from inefficient washing machines to efficient washing machines would save more than half of the 585 billion litres of water that we use in the UK every year just to wash our clothes. So shouldn't EU governments get this sorted out? Instead of relying on a few green consumers, why don't they impose minimum efficiency standards that all manufacturers would have to meet?
But so far, governments the world over have been pathetically poor at driving the kind of efficiency revolution that's required.
Well, let's talk energy.
Most of the cost of making anything, from growing food to constructing a skyscraper, is the energy used to mine the raw materials out of the ground. Ship, process, ship again, package, and deliver.
101 years ago, in 1916, oil drilling was invigorated with the introduction of a tax incentive for expensing intangible drilling and dry hole costs. The provision allowed the intangible costs of drilling a well, such as wages, fuel, and ground clearing, to be written off and deducted within the first year of the well's life, as opposed to being capitalized and depreciated over time. This essentially meant that it was cheaper and much more appealing to drill new oil wells because corporations could get immediate and full tax write-offs when they drilled, instead of having to spread the amount deducted from their taxes over the life of the well. In conjunction with this tax incentive, an oil depletion allowance was introduced into law in 1926, which allowed companies to treat a certain percentage of the oil they pulled from the ground as capital equipment and thus get a tax break from it. As a result, oil companies could deduct 27.5% from their gross revenues. Over the course of the century, oil and gas benefited from $446.98 billion in government-funded incentives. So oil didn't just sprout up as a result of new technologies and ambitions, although new tech definitely did help. It instead became entrenched in the American energy market, in large part because of government influence. Alongside the massive tax breaks that provided a strong foundation for cheap oil, the federal government indirectly influenced oil's importance through large infrastructure projects like the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. Publicly sponsored roads cemented a car-reliant culture, which ultimately meant a reliance on oil. Even further, the United States has sponsored military and diplomatic missions into an oil-rich Persian Gulf in order to safeguard a steady supply of fuel. Overall, it would not be a reach to say that the United States government has spent over $1 trillion on oil and gas in the last century. The important lesson here is that government action is necessary to influence energy markets. When it comes to energy, there is no such thing as a free market. While other sources of energy like coal, wind, and solar have definitely benefited from subsidies in the latter half of the 20th century, the overall amount pales in comparison to benefits received by oil and gas companies.
New research commissioned by The Guardian has shown that just 20 fossil fuel companies are directly related to more than a third of the greenhouse gases that have been wrecking our climate since industry became aware of the risks in the 1960s. So however much we care about our personal consumption, what really matters is political action to rein in the oil, gas and coal companies. Among privately owned firms, Chevron, Exxon, BP and Shell are high on the list of climate polluters, which is topped by Saudi Aramco and Gazprom. They and 14 other companies have drilled and pumped out the equivalent of 480 billion tons of carbon dioxide since 1965. Billions of us around the world use their products every day to fuel our cars or heat our homes. So we're all partly responsible. But the fossil fuel industry was warned about the risks a long time ago, yet it has funded campaigns since then to spread doubt about climate science. In 1965, the US President's Scientific Advisory Committee warned that fossil fuels were causing more carbon dioxide, which was altering the air on a global scale, with huge risks for humankind. Soon after that, the head of the American Petroleum Institute warned the industry that time was running out to deal with this.
Let's take a trip back to 1977. One afternoon in July of 1977, at the Exxon Corporation headquarters, an assortment of powerful oilmen received a striking report from James Black, one of the company's most senior scientists. The verdict was simple. The burning of fossil fuels was adversely affecting the global climate, and would eventually lead to disaster. Note that this was in 1977, before much of the public was even aware of the term climate change. Black presented a second assessment to a larger Exxon audience a year later, building on his previous findings and offering detailed figures. Exxon responded in what today might be seen as a bizarre fashion. They launched the most cutting-edge, empirical, thorough investigation ever into global climate change. Over the next decade, the company performed rigorous CO2 sampling and climate modeling. It assembled a panel of the sharpest minds Exxon had to offer. And then, once they had gathered a deep understanding of the state of the pending climate emergency, they launched a decades-long campaign aimed at obfuscating their findings and sowing doubt among the public. They chose to work as the tip of the spear for climate denial, spitting in the face of the evidence their own scientists had gathered. They lobbied to block federal regulations on greenhouse gas emissions and decried anything less than full autonomy for private corporations. Exxon was critical in building the colossus of misinformation that persists to this day.
Exxon decided to take out an ad in the New York Times and deliberately tried to play down the connection. Skip forward another 2 decades, and Chevron, Exxon, and BP each donate more than $500,000 to the inauguration campaign of Donald Trump, perhaps the world's most famous climate denier.
Meanwhile, just 100 companies around the world account for 71% of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions. ExxonMobil ranks number 5. This is the central con of the world's largest corporations. They've known the truth for decades, and instead of working to mitigate the effects of the catastrophe they're causing, they choose to actively mislead those vastly more likely to suffer the fallout, all in the name of profit.
Kirkpatrick Sale summarised it well. For the past 15 years, the story has been the same every year. Individual consumption, residential, by private car and so on, is never more than about a quarter of all consumption. The vast majority is commercial, industrial, corporate, by agribusiness and government. He forgot the military. So even if we all took up cycling and wood stoves, it would have a negligible impact on energy use, global warming and atmospheric pollution.
High economic inequality is extremely damaging for the environment because the greedy do not know how to control themselves. Thomas Piketty, who is a brilliant economist from Paris, has done incredible detailed work recently looking at the consumption and pollution patterns of the richest 1%. And he has shown that the richest 1% disproportionately contribute to greenhouse gases and to carbon pollution and are damaging our planet. This is because they buy so many things that they do not need because money is not an issue for them. It's because they have so many homes that they travel between. It's because when they travel, they don't travel in a sustainable way. At the extreme, they're flying in private jets. There isn't a better way to heat up the planet and damage our environment than to fly in a private jet. And we need to learn the importance of this because climate change is the biggest threat that we're facing. And we're partly facing it because we're allowing the greedy people in our societies to carry on being greedy, and we're not controlling them for the good of everybody.
This is my first time at Davos, and I find it quite a bewildering experience, to be honest. I mean, 1,500 private jets have flown in here to hear Sir David Attenborough speak about, how we're wrecking the planet. And I hear people talk in the language of participation and justice and equality and transparency. But then, almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? And of the rich just not paying their fair share. It feels like I'm at a firefighters conference and no one's allowed to speak about water, right? there was only one panel, actually.
Well, we've had two. You're the second of our panelists.
There was only one panel.
Let's go there.
One panel hidden away in the media center that was actually about tax avoidance. Yeah. I was one of the 15 participants. So something needs to change here. 10 years ago, the World Economic Forum asked the question, what must industry do to prevent a broad social backlash? The answer is very simple. Just stop talking about philanthropy and start talking about taxes. Taxes. We need to, just 2 days ago, there was a billionaire in here, what's his name? Michael Dell. And he asked the question like, name me one country where a top marginal tax rate of 70% has actually worked. And, I'm a historian. The United States, that's where it has actually worked. In the 1950s, during Republican President Eisenhower, the war veteran, the top marginal tax rate in the US was 91% for people like Michael Dell. The top estate tax for people like Michael Dell was more than 70%. This is not rocket science. We can talk for a very long time about all these stupid philanthropy schemes. We can invite Bono once more, but come on, we gotta be talking about taxes. Yeah, exactly. That's it, taxes, taxes, taxes. All the rest is bullshit, in my opinion.
We have a tax system that leaks so much that allows $170 billion of money every year to be taken to tax havens and to be denied the developing countries that need that money most. So we have to look at the business model, and we have to look at the role of governments to tax and plow back money into people's lives.
A century of artificial scarcity has produced a destabilized, dehumanized, war-torn world, where the power and wealth have been transferred from the many to the hands of the few.
Neoliberalism effectively exempted billionaires and large corporations from the constraints of democracy, from paying their taxes, from not polluting, from having to pay fair wages. Because what neoliberalism has done is to destroy effective political choice. It's been to destroy democratic power. And so, from the perspective of most people, politics is then reduced to a meaningless yabba taking place above their heads. It's of no relevance, and political debate becomes pointless. All people hear with political debate is one self-serving elite talking to another self-serving elite, and none of it making any sense to the rest of us. And when you get that situation, when politics has effectively been drained of relevance to our lives, then you get a reactive anti-politics taking its place. And anti-politics, which incidentally is fomented with the help of atomization. When communities are broken, when society is broken, when we don't anymore enjoy the sense of common purpose, then it's much more likely that a demagogic, extremist anti-politics will fill that gap. And of course, that is another product of neoliberalism, that atomization of society.
Given the sheer weight of scientific knowledge and public concern, you'd think the petroleum industry would be trying to pull less oil and gas out of the ground. But you'd be wrong. They're actually planning to pump out more, which would destroy any chance we have of keeping global temperatures at a safe level. So reining in our dependence on fossil fuels and ramping up the transition to renewable energy has never been more important, both for us and for countless generations to come. But that's not just about personal choices, it's about political action.
An inconvenient truth helped raise consciousness about global warming. But did you notice that all of the solutions presented had to do with personal consumption? Changing light bulbs, inflating tires, driving half as much?
one of us is a cause of global warming, but each of us can make choices to change that. With the things we buy, the electricity we use, the cars we drive, we can make choices to bring our individual carbon emissions to zero.
But even if every person in the United States did everything the movie suggested, US carbon emissions would fall by only 22%. And scientific consensus is that emissions must be reduced by at least 75% worldwide.
Well-intentioned eco-groups and half-baked public policy initiatives have shifted the burden onto the average global citizen. What other option did they have? How are politicians supposed to fund their re-election campaigns without generous donations from the oil and gas lobby? If Exxon wants tax breaks, less oversight, and complete autonomy, who else could they pressure to, quote, save the planet? The answer, of course, is the rest of us. The vast majority of the world's population that has no sway over legislation and certainly none over corporate greed. And so we're told to switch to electric cars, take public transportation, stop using the elevator, unplug appliances, recycle, stop wasting food, buy less meat, shop local. Many of us do it, and it helps to ease our conscience as we watch coastal towns and small tropical islands flood and their populations evacuate their homes. In May of 2019, CO2 levels hit 415 parts per million for the first time in 3 million years. Not since the Industrial Revolution, not since the advent of agriculture, but for the first time since humans have existed. 3 million years ago, in the Pliocene era, the world was much warmer. Sea levels are estimated to have been up to 90 feet higher than they are today. That's the kind of world 415 parts per million produces. The list of cities and islands that would be completely submerged is extensive. Miami, Amsterdam, Lisbon, New Orleans, and hundreds of other towns, cities, and islands would go under, displacing millions of people. All so Exxon and others like them can keep paying their executives millions of dollars in bonuses.
The world as it is today is a place where companies have replaced countries. It is no longer the governments of countries that decide how things run and how people live. Instead, prime ministers have been replaced by directors, presidents with CEOs, parliaments with board members, and civil servants with business strategists. Dominant shareholders drive policies, not constituents. Journalists who prize access to the powerful more than they prize the truth report lies and propaganda to propel us into wars around the world. Artists who use their talents to foster the myths and illusions that bombard our society live comfortably in the Hollywood Hills. The arts, just as hungry as the media for corporate money and sponsorship, refuse to address the social and economic disparities that create suffering for tens of millions of citizens. Commercial artists peddle mythical narratives, once propagated by corporations, self-help gurus, and the Christian right, that if we dig deep enough within ourselves, focus on happiness, find our inner strength, or believe in miracles, we can have everything we desire. We inhabit a system of inverted totalitarianism, the political coming of age of corporate power and the political demobilization of the citizen. The corporate forces behind inverted totalitarianism do not replace decaying structures with new revolutionary ones. They do not import new symbols or iconography as classic totalitarianism movements do. They do not offer a radical alternative. Corporate power claims to honor electoral politics, freedom and constitutions, but these corporate forces corrupt and manipulate power as to make democracy impossible.
But what can we do?
One of the big steps we need to make, both for climate breakdown and for a whole suite of other environmental disasters and humanitarian ones, we have to switch from an animal-based diet to a plant-based diet.
When you eat a burger, it's not just the cow who dies. Producing meat, fish, and dairy is the main driver for wiping out the world's wildlife, for trashing trees, and causing our oceans to collapse.
Consumer culture and the capitalist mindset have taught us to substitute acts of personal lifestyle choices for organized political resistance. The same is true for spiritual enlightenment. This is not organized political resistance. I want to be clear. I'm not saying that we shouldn't live simply. But I don't pretend that not buying much, or not driving much, or not having kids is a powerful political act, or that it's deeply revolutionary. Because it isn't. Personal change does not equal social change. At this point, it should be pretty easy to recognize that every action involving the industrial economy is destructive. And we shouldn't pretend that solar photovoltaics, for example, exempt us from this. They still require mining and transportation infrastructures at every point in the production process. The same can be said for every other so-called green technology. Besides being ineffective at causing the sorts of changes necessary to stop this culture from killing the planet, there are at least 4 other problems. The first is that it's predicated on the flawed notion that humans inevitably harm their land base, ignoring the fact that humans can help the Earth as well as harm it. We can rehabilitate streams, we can get rid of noxious invasives, we can remove dams, we can disrupt a political system tilted towards the rich, as well as an extractive economic system. The second problem is that it incorrectly assigns blame to the individual, and most especially to individuals who are particularly powerless, instead of to those who actually wield power in this system, and to the system itself. The third problem, the role of an activist, is not to navigate systems of oppressive power with as much personal integrity as possible, but rather to confront and take down those systems. The fourth problem is that it accepts capitalism's redefinition of us from citizens to consumers. By accepting this redefinition, we reduce our potential forms of resistance to consuming and not consuming.
Instead of letting ourselves off the hook by simply pledging to eat less meat or take fewer transatlantic flights, we need to shake off the mindset of individualism and consumerism, and start to see ourselves as an interconnected group of people with a common goal. The prevailing cultural zeitgeist in the West, the willingness to see ourselves as merely consumers as opposed to citizens, is no accident. That mindset was built, slowly and deliberately, over several decades. Since Reagan and Thatcher, the prime motivation of government has been to deregulate, privatize, give tax cuts to corporations, and remove any barriers to the exercise of unaccountable corporate power, while dismantling anything even remotely threatening to private power, especially unions and regulatory committees. In the 40 years since these policies have become staples of Western governance, corporations have been able to amass mountains of profit and thereby manipulate the very government that gave them their power.
If we actually want to change the world, we can't talk only about consumers voting with our dollars. Real change happens when citizens come together to demand rules that work.
Citizens have a much wider range of available resistance tactics, including voting or not voting, running for office, pamphleting, boycotting, organising, lobbying, protesting. And when a government becomes destructive of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we have the right to alter or abolish it.
Real peace, with real justice, we will not go home and be quiet. We will go home and organize.
So how do we make big change? To answer that question, I went back and looked at Gandhi, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the US civil rights movement, and the environmental victories here in the 1970s. They didn't just nag people to perfect their day-to-day choices, they changed the rules of the game.
We are in the midst of a crisis, as predicted 4 decades ago by the very orchestrators of the crisis, and they will not give up their control without a fight. Throughout history, only mass movements have been able to turn the tide against seemingly insurmountable odds. We have to stop thinking as individuals and reignite the natural human desire to work together to make the world a better place for all of us.
It turns out there are 3 things you find whenever people get together and actually change the world. First, they share a big idea for how things could be better. Not just a little better for a few people, a whole lot better for everyone. And they don't just tinker around the edges. They go right to the heart of the problem, even when it means changing systems that don't want to be changed. And that can be scary. Hey, millions of us already share a big idea for how things can be better. Instead of this dinosaur economy that focuses only on corporate profits, we want a new economy that puts safe products, happy people, and a healthy planet first. Duh! Isn't that what an economy should be for? Trying to live eco-perfectly in today's system is like trying to swim upstream when the current is pushing us all the other way. But by changing what our economy prioritizes, we can change that current so that the right thing becomes the easiest thing to do. Second, the millions of ordinary people who made these extraordinary changes didn't try to do it alone. They They didn't just say, I will be more responsible. They said, we will work together until the problem is solved. Finally, these movements succeeded in creating change because they took their big idea and their commitment to work together, and then they took action. Did you know that when Martin Luther King Jr. organized his March on Washington, less than a quarter of Americans supported him? But that was enough to make change because those supporters took action. They did stuff. Today, 74% of Americans support tougher laws on toxic chemicals. 83% want clean energy laws. 85% think corporations should have less influence in government. We've got the big idea and the commitment. We just haven't turned it all into massive action yet. And this is our only missing piece. So let's do it.
Replacement, even in the digital age, for human bodies next to each other, standing as one, hearts beating as one, voices raised as one.
If you don't fight for what you want, you deserve what you get. We will not be stopped.
Take action right now. This is the issue I will vote on. This is the issue I will give money on. This is the issue that I will scream at the top of my lungs into a bullhorn.
Being a responsible citizen starts with voting. That's one of those basic things that everyone's just got to do. But it gets way more exciting and fun when we put our unique skills and interests to work alongside thousands of others. I know that changing a whole economic system is a huge challenge. It's not easy to see a clear path from where we are today to where we need to go. And there's no 10 simple things we can do without leaving our couches. But the path didn't start out clear to all these guys either. Dr. King said, faith is taking the first step even though you don't see the whole staircase. So they worked hard to get organized, practiced the small acts that built their citizen muscles, and kept their focus on their big idea. And when the time was right, they were ready.
Things change for lots of different reasons. There's all kinds of dynamics, but one central element is people being in the streets.
All of us must stand up together and say, no more.
We live in a culture that doesn't tell us our own history, doesn't tell us the history of social movement wins. And the times in our past when masses of people have taken the wheel of history and turned it.
This march will go down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, demonstrations for freedom and human dignity ever held in the United States.
Changing the goal of the entire economy is a huge task. Of course, we can't do it all at once. But when we focus on game-changing solutions, we gradually make it possible for a new game to be played. To do that, we have to be able to tell the difference between a game-changing solution or just a new way to play that old game of more. Whenever I'm asked to join in on a solution, I want to know if it's transformational. Will it change the goal? To figure it out, I use the word goal. I want to know that it, G, gives people more power, taking power back from corporations to build democracy. O, opens people's eyes to the truth that once basic needs are met, happiness and well-being don't come from buying more stuff, but from our communities, our health, and a sense of purpose. A, accounts for all the costs it creates, including the toll it takes on people and the planet. In other words, it internalizes costs instead of externalizing them, as most businesses do today. L, lessens the enormous wealth gap between those who can't even meet their basic needs and those who consume way more than their fair share. When I see a solution that does all that, or can be redesigned to, I'm in. And how about the new trend of collaborative consumption, formerly known as sharing? Sharing may sound like the theme of a Barney song, but think about it. It's a huge challenge to the old game. It gets us off the treadmill of more, conserves resources, gives people access to stuff they otherwise couldn't afford, and builds community. What's it look like? Bike share programs in major cities. Online platforms that let us share everything from our cars to our homes to camping gear. In my town, the public library system lends out tools. There's just no reason that every house needs its own power drill, creme brulee torch, scanner, wheelbarrow, bike pump when we can share. As transformational solutions like these gain traction, we will reach a tipping point if we keep focused on the new goal of better. Now it's time to build the solutions. Solutions that won't just change a few of the rules, but will change the entire game. Want to help? Come on, let's do it.